for people who are literally starting from step number one, just not snacking and focusing on their macros is going to be a huge, first of all, it's going to be the first step, but it's going to help them majorly head in the right direction, right? If that's number one, what's number two?
Well, usually it's the snacking and changing macros. And then it's going from not eating from dinner to breakfast. And for a lot of people, that's terrifying. What do you mean? I don't snack after dinner? I don't get a snack? I don't get to have a glass of wine? I don't get to have a piece of dessert? No. Dinner to breakfast, which for some people can be 13, 14 hours. And it's the realization that they can do it and they're not going to die overnight and they're going to wake up in the morning and actually feel pretty good. And most people aren't actually hungry when they wake up. So they're like, wow, I went 13 hours without eating. This is fantastic. I can do this.
Yeah. And so it's not like we're talking about like Jenny Craig Weight Watchers, like you're using all this willpower. You're actually fundamentally saying when you feed your body with the right stuff, you're just not finding yourself hungry. Now, initially, there may be an emotional component of it. You mentioned there's a lot of reasons why people eat that are separate to hunger. But once you kind of get into it, you're just finding yourself not hungry. It's not willpower.
Right. And I think it's one of those really profoundly powerful realizations that people understand. Your body has all the things it needs to do fine, not eating while you're sleeping. We're not eating from 6 o'clock at night until 8 o'clock in the morning. Your body genuinely, other than hydrating, and you can have coffee, you can have tea, your body does just fine not eating. And I think we've been telling our patients for so many years, eat to stoke your metabolism, eat snacks in between so that your blood sugar stays stable. And so it's really, helping to reverse cognitive dissonance, which I think is really, really powerful.
No, I love that. A couple more things that we have over here that are just good clarifications. We talked so much in our first episode and a little bit in this about the power of intermittent fasting that's there. And one of the questions we got in was, what about intermittent fasting while breastfeeding and producing an abundant milk supply? Just a good opportunity for you to like clarify things.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of fasting when women are pregnant or breastfeeding because you're either growing a human or feeding a human. And I know back in the days 1,000 years ago when I had newborns at home and I breastfed them for a year, you're voraciously hungry. I mean, your body needs more discretionary calories at that point than about any other time in your lifetime. And so I caution women, really genuinely caution women, if you want to produce nutrient-dense, great breast milk, do not restrict your meals. I have never been hungrier. And I jokingly remember my cousin who's an OBGYN said, when you are breastfeeding, if you're doing it right, you are as hungry as a linebacker. And I don't think I've ever been able to eat so much food in my life. Like I look at my teenagers and I'm like, I remember being able to eat that much food. So I would caution women, pregnant and breastfeeding, no fasting. If you decide that you want to do 12 hours of digestive rest, you may be really, really hungry at the end of that 12 hours. But I would really caution women not to do that.
Another question we have here is on the topic of sort of plant-based eating. How do you help and sort of navigate your people that are following you who have made the decision to be vegan or plant-based, and any kind of things that you would share with them about getting the amount of protein that's there? And do they have to be supplementing or doing any kind of combination to hit the type of macros that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a great question. Obviously, I respect if people are making that decision. I think the challenge is getting enough protein in along with not having a high amount of exogenous carbohydrate intake. And by that, I mean, I'm not a fan of soy. So I always just put it out there and I say, I know people will focus in on soy, but I would rather.
And could you explain why you're not a fan of soy?
Yeah. I mean, most soy that's created here in the United States or made here in the United States is genetically modified. A lot of the soy-based products, unless it's fermented miso or tempeh, you're just exposed to a lot of GMO byproducts and byproducts of the processed food industry. Soybean oil, as an example, again, not per se a protein, is the number one consumed fat in the United States. And it's a byproduct of the processed food industry. So I'm generally not a huge fan of soy. With that being said, when you start looking at the plant-based proteins, hemp hearts, leaning into lentils and beans and things like that, if someone's already insulin resistant, if someone's already metabolically unhealthy, it's going to be very challenging to get them to a certain level of protein intake and not overdo it with carbohydrates. Gabrielle Lyon always does a great job talking about if you have an 8-ounce steak versus a certain amount of quinoa, the steak is going to give you the amount of protein you need with no carbohydrates versus to get 6 cups of quinoa, it's going to be an exorbitant amount of carbohydrates at a very reduced amount of protein intake. So I think there's a very delicate balance. I would really encourage people to, work with a nutritionist or a clinician who's savvy to be able to make recommendations. Obviously, I have a couple coaches on my team that are primarily plant-based. They do eat some animal-based protein, but examining, do you eat eggs? Do you eat any dairy? If you're doing those, it can be helpful. I do have some, lacto-ovo vegetarians, and they get a little bit, and obviously with the vegans, it's a little bit more challenging. So really examining, where can you navigate getting sufficient amounts of protein in and not having too many discretionary carbohydrates if you are indeed insulin resistant. What's interesting is you look at the research about needs for vegetarians and vegans. They're generally not getting enough creatine in their diets. And so those in particular are really at risk for not having enough creatine. And creatine monohydrate is one of the most well-researched supplements that's out there. Good solid research about brain health, muscle health, et cetera. Vegetarians and vegans need about 5 grams a day versus omnivores need about 3 grams a day. So understanding that can be beneficial. Also, looking at some of the B vitamins that can be helpful. But again, working with someone that's going to be able to do some testing to help navigate what's best for you.
On the topic of supplementation, you mentioned that one of the ones that you include is melatonin. Mm-hmm. Recently, there's been a bunch of different things that are kind of on the topic of melatonin. Is any of some of the research questioning how beneficial it is or maybe the harmful sides? People are often confused. So just because you're kind of in the know on these things, do you have any concerns about any of that with melatonin?
Yes, I do. And I think it's a great question. So my 15-year-old who I keep talking about, he wants to take melatonin. He's trying to explain to me, I'm having trouble falling asleep and we're having to talk about sleep hygiene. He's 15. His body makes plenty of melatonin. I don't like younger people to be taking melatonin chronically because it could potentially impact your own endogenous secretion of melatonin. However, interestingly enough, I had a really great conversation with Dr. Kyle Gillette on my podcast, and he was saying women north of 40, well, men too, we don't make as much endogenous melatonin as we once did. It's not only a sleep hormone, it's also a master antioxidant. So in adrenal pause, remember I was talking about this earlier, when women are going through these transitions, maybe men it's not as dramatic. I do start seeing a tremendous amount of value in supplementing melatonin. Now it's supplementing the right amount at the right time. And we don't start with melatonin. It really has to start with those foundational sleep basics that I was alluding to earlier. Because I think so many of us, we're like, I just want to take a pill.
Even in the wellness industry, there's this goal to just take a pill.
Correct. And so I always have to caution people, like the lifestyle stuff still needs to be there because the supplement may not fix a problem that could have been fixed by, gosh, maybe you just need to get off electronics. Maybe you need some light exposure in the morning. Maybe, do all those things first so you don't have to add a supplement if it's not necessary. For full disclosure, I take melatonin every night, along with my progesterone, and it's had a huge net impact on my sleep quality. But I do that in the context of understanding as a middle-aged woman, I do benefit from taking exogenous melatonin, even though my body's just making less, much like everything else. So I do find that there's a lot of value, but I think a lot of it is in the context of other lifestyle choices and age range. So a 20-year-old should not need melatonin all the time. If you're 35 and you're traveling, so like there's good research on jet lag and utilization of melatonin. I myself don't take melatonin when I travel because I've just found that with fasting, I'm able to kind of help my body get onto that time zone that I'm in much more readily and easily. But there's good solid research about melatonin utilization in jet lag.
Most of the melatonin that people take is a synthetically created melatonin. And a few years ago, I met these guys that created this company called Herbatonin. I have no affiliation with them. They're out of Australia. And then recently, one of my dear friends from the world of functional medicine community, Dr. Deanna Minnick, she's IFM on like the board of educators and other things. She recently, I think, joined their company because she was so excited about the research that they were doing. And she's been putting out a lot of content recently. Again, I have no affiliation with them about what happens when you go to a plant-based melatonin versus a synthetic melatonin. And it seems really interesting how there's sort of some of the nuances that are there. I'll send it over to you to, give it a read, but I'd love your take on it. But I use that occasionally. I'll use this plant-based melatonin, and everything that I've read from her makes me feel like, okay, I'm not as worried about some of the negative side effects, which I heard one time Andrew Huberman talking on Joe Rogan podcast about shrinking men's testicles. But it was it was mice research that was done, but still that adds in a little bit of caution. You're like, okay, cool. I need to look into this a little bit more, but I like the work that they've been doing at Herbatonin, and I need to dig into it. Maybe I'll have her on the podcast to chat a little bit more about it.
No, and it's interesting because the comments about me talking about melatonin were according to Dr. Huberman. And I was like, I knew this was coming. And then I explained, I said, in the context of life stage and age, there are benefits. So yes, I think that Dr. Huberman, who he's up on a pedestal in terms of amazing and fantastic content. But it was definitely one of those times where I was like, I know this is coming. I know there's going to be a comment like Dr. Huberman said. I was like, yes, yes. And he is correct. However, like looking at it from another perspective and in having the ability to talk to so many clinicians and amazing people, I'm always like, so what do you think about this?
Right. And it works. And again, some of the cautionary stuff is primarily, again, this is okay research, but it's not the greatest research. Is you have these mice that you're putting things through. I want to put in a little bit of a plug for just magnesium, because I've often found that sometimes people need melatonin, but especially if